Hi, and welcome to another edition of This is Vinyl. Today is a personal favourite of mine. We're talking to Professor Jim Allan, who by day is a professor of cancer genetics at the Northern Centre for Cancer Research in Newcastle. And his alter ego and his little side hustle is that he's a Beatles fanatic. This guy knows so much about collecting Beatles vinyl, what to look for, what not to look for, different versions, different pressings. If you're a fan, I think you'll find this is exactly for you. So welcome, Professor Jim Allan. So welcome to another edition of This is Vinyl. We're going to do a special one this morning because we're going to spend an entire episode looking at the Beatles, probably the biggest band in the world that there ever has been, quite possibly ever will be. With me today is Professor Jim Allan from the Northern Centre for Cancer Research, who, Jim, is that right? You specialising in cancer genetics and childhood leukemia and the Beatles?
Yeah, well, yes, cancer genetics mostly. That's what I do for my day job. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. So how come that a man as educated and esteemed as yourself has this side hustle as an expert in all things?
Yeah, expert's a little bit strong, but I'll take it as a compliment. Yeah. So I think for me, Mark, I mean, fundamentally, you talk to any fan of the Beatles, fundamentally it comes down to the music. The music is just, the core of why we all love the Beatles at the end of the day. But for me, I was thinking back, when I first started to get interested in music, and there's probably one event that sort of really triggered it, and that was in 1980. I remember asking my parents about a news story that hit, and this was, of course, John Lennon's assassination, and had no idea at this point who this person was, or the Beatles hadn't really registered for me, and his death in 1980 sort of triggered an interest and drove me to look a little bit more into who this man was and who this group was, and start listening to some more of their music. And of course, once you start listening, it's impossible not to get hooked. And then, of course, I did what most people did then. Uh, Go to my local record shop. We had one record shop in the very small town I was living in the Lake District
Mhm.
in Cumbria, and saved up religiously for weeks at a time to get enough money to buy the next Beatles LP that I was interested in,
Yeah.
and took several years to get my collection together. These
What?
were all, of course, 1980s presses, which we can talk about a little bit later on. So they certainly weren't original presses. So I'm definitely a second generation Beatles fan, I think. And in fact, the Beatles already broke up when I was born, the early 70s.
What was
So
what was the first album that you bought? The first Beatles record?
I think it was Rubber Soul, if I remember correctly. I suspect it was probably related to what was in the shop at the time.
Yeah.
And I certainly remember some of the LPs you had to order. Um, so you had to, speak to the shopkeeper and he would order them in. And it would take several weeks to come. And of course, this is all pre-internet. Didn't really have access to that sort of thing. So it was just really what you could find in your local shop. And it was a little bit sort of an Arkwright style shop, an open all hours style shop.
Right.
I do distinctly remember the shopkeeper wore one of those horrible brown
Really?
shop overcoats. Yes, it was quite remarkable. But he had this fabulous little record section at the back of the shop, and you could go and listen to the records, which of course is quite unusual now, and decide which one you wanted. I do remember the last one I bought actually, that completed my collection. This is almost certainly due to the price, but the last one was the White Album, and
Mhm.
with it being a double album, that was the last one I remember buying, and I had to save up an extra long time to get that one. Lots of pocket money and paper rounds to afford that one.
So you have you are a collector.
Mm.
I know this because you come in and you buy some pretty good records, if I might say so, from my shop, and you always kind of want, which is I do the same thing. I want a good, high quality, good condition, preferably first or second pressing of the bands and the artists that I love. Some of the stuff, it's kind of, I don't mind, I don't care, I just want something to listen to. But Um, so have you got parameters on your Beatles collection? How big is
Yeah,
it?
yeah, okay. Not terribly big, probably about 40 LPs, something like that. So I'm a little bit selective. I really like high quality, good condition records, which of course, when you think, we're collecting cardboard and plastic from the 1960s, finding good quality records, is not easy, certainly not easy at all. So I'm a little bit fussy about what I like to add to my collection. So I'm quite happy to wait and try and find that sort of pristine, almost pristine copy. I mean, of course, it's really hard to find good quality copies. I mean, you've had several in your shop that you've very kindly offered to me, which has been fabulous.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm just a little bit fussy. And I do like you. I do like the first press issues. I think there's something a little bit more authentic about them
Yeah.
than some of the sort of jazzed up represses that you get now.
So what do you, when you're searching for this? So for someone who's watching this or listening to this, what do you have to look for when you're looking for a first pressing of an? Just generally, we can get into specifics later on.
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost is probably the matrix number on the actual vinyl record itself. So this is the catalog number that's stamped in the dead wax near to the label, and that usually will indicate whether the record is a first press. And for some of the LPs, the cover will also have first press characteristics. But certainly, it's the matrix number that's in the dead wax that's usually the giveaway that tells you when the record was pressed, and actually what tape it was pressed from, whether it was pressed from the original master tape or it's a later pressing or whatever. So that's sort of the bottom line, really. I mean, there's features of all characteristics, the label, the cover, the inner sleeve, can all sort of add to identifying a first press, but fundamentally the matrix numbers, I think the first thing that we go to see if it's a first press.
So you're like a little vinyl detective in some respects, looking for the clues to figure out the authenticity of it. I mean, do you carry these numbers around in your head, or have you got a little notebook you take around with you and go like, okay, this is the matrix number I need now?
Well, we don't need to because we've got Discogs.
That's
So Discogs is the online marketplace for buying and selling records, and they catalog um, pretty much everything that's ever been released in the UK. And you can go and search for the matrix numbers on there and search for the LPs and find the original first press matrix numbers. Some of the matrix numbers do get ingrained on the brain. So a good example, of course, is the famous Remix 11 for Revolver, the very first press of the Beatles Revolver, XCX 606-1, which is the side 2 matrix number of that LP. And that denotes the first press, which has the alternative Remix 11 of John Lennon's Tomorrow Never Knows. So that's highly sought after by collectors. And that matrix number sort of, every Beatles collector will be able to recall that matrix number offhand. But
yeah.
certainly for most of them, I don't remember. I don't have a catalog style memory of the matrix numbers for every album.
That's a relief because I thought you might, and I was going to feel very inadequate that
No,
I,
no.
I don't have that. So we've talked a little bit about what makes the Beatles kind of collectible. I get a lot of people coming into the shop and they look at the Beatles section in the racks and go, my God, I've got all of these records and I didn't realize how much they were worth. And sometimes they say, I'm going to bring them in and you can buy them off me. And they bring me in some pretty shoddy condition 1980s repress versions, thinking that they are the authentic version. But
Mhm.
is this the only thing that can make the Beatles kind of uncollectible as well as collectible? I mean, we're talking because there's such vast numbers of a lot of these albums that they're not rare.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously back in the 60s, they sold millions of records, and the LPs have never been out of press. Even sort of, right through the 80s and into the 90s. I mean, they pressed fewer in the 90s because, of course, fewer records generally were
Yeah.
pressed in the 90s. But certainly in the 80s, they pressed a lot of represses, and then more recently, they've been repressing and remixing and pressing those remixes. So there's almost certainly more Beatles records pressed post 1960s than there were during the 1960s. But even then, there were millions of them pressed. So there's just a huge number of records out there. And for a long time, actually, the 80s presses were not collectible at all. But interestingly, they're starting to become a little bit more collectible now, because many of them were, in fact, all of them, most of the 80s ones were original analog presses. So they were cut from the original analog master tapes. So they're becoming, certainly the 70s and some of the 80s presses are becoming a lot more collectible now.
Yeah.
Still not quite as highly prized as the original 60s presses, but still fairly highly prized. So yeah, they're starting to demand a little bit more money.
Yeah, I mean, those are the ones I think that I probably, when I was buying, I was buying those ones because they were the ones that were currently in, they were in the shops in the late 70s, early 80s, when I was picking up a lot of these things. So if I look through my collection, the original ones that I bought, quite a few of them are the 80s presses, and I've kind of acquired earlier pressings as I've kind of, gone through it. Just as I come across them, it's kind of, oh, I'll have that one, I'll add it to. So I've actually got, probably like you, several copies of things like the White Album and Revolver, Abbey Road and Sergeant Pepper's and stuff, just because they are slightly different versions. And to be fair, I maybe didn't treat them that well when I first had them, when I went to college, and they went to parties and stuff like that. So a few of them are not perhaps in the condition that you would like if you were searching for something for your collection. So that's also the other reason I've kind of added to it. So should we get into a couple of specific releases, and we can talk about kind of what makes them collectible? So I know you've got some with you there, which you're going to hold up, and we can talk about. I've got a couple here. So do you want to go early to late? What should we add?
Yeah, we can start early. Should we start early?
Let's start early. Let's go early.
Should we start at the beginning?
Let's do that.
Yeah. So the first LP, Please Please Me, this is actually first press sleeve, and you can tell that from this little photographer credit at the bottom.
Okay, Jim is holding up a copy of Please Please Me, the first album. And so what's that? The bottom right hand corner.
The bottom right hand corner has the photographer credit, Angus McBain, who was the Welsh photographer who took this picture, which is taken at EMI headquarters in Manchester Square in London, looking through
the famous one with the Beatles looking down.
Yeah. So the first press sleeves are denoted by the fact that the photographer credit starts at the end of the letter S that you can see here. So on later presses, and I've got one here just for comparison. See if I can show that. You can see here on the later press. It starts a little bit further in under the letter G. Okay,
so something that small, a little detail like that can denote the difference between a first press sleeve in this instance.
Yeah. So this is what's called a black and gold sleeve, and all of these first presses were made by one company, Ernest J. Day and Company, which is credited down here. So black and gold sleeve, and the reason it's called a black and gold sleeve is, of course, the record itself was pressed on this fabulous black and gold label that you can see there.
That's so yeah, the black background with the gold parlophone.
The sort of true gold. So this was in press for a relatively short time, and then the parlophone label design changed to a canary yellow on black, which does often sometimes get mistaken for gold, but it's actually canary yellow. So the very first presses have this true gold lettering. And this is a mono press. And there are quite a few of these around, but these are now starting to, or in fact have been for a while, commanding significant significant funds to purchase one of these
how much are we talking for that one that you've got there?
I think a really good copy in nice condition, you'd be looking at least four figures, so over £1,000. I mean, even a rough copy in poor condition, those still sell for sort of £200 or £300. They're a really nice copy, over £1,000. In some cases, the monos are going for even higher, up to £2,000. and beyond. But of course, the real holy grail is the stereo version,
Right.
that LP. Of course, back in the early 1960s, stereo was a much rarer format.
Mhm.
The vast majority of LPs sold, certainly to the young music fans of the day, were mono, but stereo was significantly rarer.
Mhm.
Getting hold of one of those is extremely difficult, and a really good copy of one of those LPs, Please Please Me, in really good condition. I mean, you're looking at least probably £10,000
Wow.
to acquire one of those, possibly even a little bit more. I don't have one of those. What I do have, however, is I can show you this. This is actually a Parlophone record, a stereo first edition from that time period. This is as you can see, a Peter Sellers LP. You can imagine trying to get that sleeve through now.
Well, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, you
uh,
would. Jim is holding up an album called Songs for Swinging. What is it?
Swinging Sellers.
Songs for Swinging Sellers, as in Peter Sellers, which actually has just you can just see the legs of someone hanging from a tree with a wanted poster on it. So yeah, you wouldn't get that out that sleeve through.
No. So this is a interesting LP because it was one of John Lennon's favorite LPs,
Right.
and he purchased this in his younger days, and he was a big fan of the Goon Show
Yeah.
and particularly of Peter Sellers, and they became good friends actually through the 1960s. So this is a first press stereo edition of Peter Sellers LP, and you can see it's actually in really nice condition.
Yeah, it is.
And I can show you the label just to see what stereo label looks like.
So this will be what the Beatles stereo label would look like as
Yeah,
well. And we've got
exactly.
background on the gold lettering.
Yeah. So you can see it's really nice. So yeah, an equivalent copy of Please Please Me on this label, at least £10,000, if not potentially quite a bit more.
Wow. So if you're listening out there and you have one of these, then I will give you 100 quid for it right now. So, I mean, we talking about the mono versus stereo. I mean, you touched on that a little bit, but it never really occurred to me that obviously with some of the stereo versions, it's very early stereo because I can't remember which album it is I've got of the Beatles that I was playing recently, and if you pan left and right, you get half the band on one side, so you might get bass and drums or something, and a backing vocal, and then you get the guitar and vocals on the other side. Some of
Yeah,
them,
that's a bit of a
great.
problem actually with some
Yeah,
of the early stereo presses. So as I mentioned earlier, the mono format was the dominant format in the early 60s.
mm,
And certainly, thinking about the Beatles and George Martin, their producer, they would spend a lot of time working on the mono mix because, of course, they knew that was the format they were going to sell most copies of. And the stereo mix was essentially an afterthought.
yeah,
And it was they would spend a lot less time on it. In fact, the Beatles wouldn't really be involved in the stereo mix at all, and George Martin would just generate that very quickly.
yeah,
And one consequence of that is that there's very hard panning on the stereo mix, so you'd have the vocals very hard in one channel and the instruments very hard in the other channel. So it can be quite discombobulating to listen to, and particularly on headphones. Those early stereo mixes are quite painful, I think.
yeah. But I guess as a collector, you sort of want those crazy stereo mixes to sit alongside your lovely mono.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah. I mean, I think some of the modern stereo mixes are a lot better.
yeah.
They're certainly a lot kinder on the ears than the original 60s. There is one exception, however. I've got a copy of it here. Let me just have a look. Did I bring it down?
Jim is furiously searching through a pile of records right now.
Got it here. I've got it right here. So it's this one here.
Okay,
So this is with the Beatles. This is a first press stereo edition.
right.
And I'll show you the label for this. See, this is now on the canary yellow.
Yes, so it's quite
Oh,
different to that gold label, isn't it? So yeah,
so the first stereo mix of this is actually fabulous,
is it?
and it's widely regarded as the best early stereo mix of any of the Beatle albums. So that's very listenable, very good quality stereo mix.
And how do you differentiate between that first stereo mix and other mixes that you might get of that album?
It's the matrix number again. In this case, the -1 matrix numbers,
Yeah.
you can identify them by. But that's a very good mix. I mean, compared to the other early stereo mixes of Beatles albums, that's certainly regarded as probably the best.
So were other bands around at the time doing stereo mixes, or was George Martin a bit groundbreaking in this?
No, no, other bands were doing them. There was a market for it, but it was very limited. But yeah, certainly a lot of the other bands were doing them as well. But again, the dominant format was the mono format.
And that's
Uh,
probably driven by what people are listening to it on, because a lot of the time, I guess in the 60s, you're looking at kind of dancette style
yeah,
turntables or record players. I'm guessing that it would be the slightly better off record collector would have a turntable which would actually have that stereo capability, and would probably want
mm,
to then go and buy the stereo record. I remember when I was a kid, a friend of my parents had got a quadraphonic system. It's like 4 speakers in this one room, which I thought was incredible at the time, because it was I could stand in the middle and get just this consumed in this sound. I think he played an ELO record on there or something, which is just like, God, this is like magic. This is amazing.
yeah.
um,
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the those dancette record players, and most of the teenagers would have one of those, and they would play their records on those, and of course played mono records.
yeah, that's right.
And you couldn't even play a stereo record on those because you'd damage it. So there was no great value to buying a stereo record
Mm.
if you had one of those players. And they weren't they certainly weren't hi-fi reproducers, let's put it that way.
Yeah,
So a
no,
lot of the mono records in the early 60s were cut very loud to be played, designed to be, they were cut essentially designed to be played on those single speaker dancette record players in primarily teenagers' bedrooms, essentially. In contrast, the stereo format was very much the domain of what you and I are now, which is middle-aged men,
yeah.
most who could afford these expensive stereo systems, and actually primarily played classical music. So that was the major format. But there was a small niche market for pop and an early rock in the early 1960s as it started to develop
Yeah,
on the stereo format. So those albums are certainly out there, but they're extremely hard to find.
yeah, yeah.
And then,
So
of course, by the sort of mid to late 60s, stereo became a lot more popular, and these inflection point probably somewhere between Sergeant Pepper and the White Album, where
yeah,
stereo started to dominate. And then by 1969, mono had essentially died a death and became, obsolete essentially, or mostly obsolete, and stereo became the dominant format. And we end with actually the Beatles' last album. The last album was only pressed in, the last two albums actually only pressed in stereo and
right.
sound absolutely fabulous.
Yeah. So moving on from Please Please Me, what we got next on the list there?
Let's have. Do you want to? I tell you what. Let's have a chat about Sergeant Pepper. Yeah, should we do that?
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. So,
So Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This was at the time, and even since then, widely recognised as possibly one of the most groundbreaking records that's ever been made. And Jim's going to tell us why that is.
yeah. Well, of course, I think primarily again two reasons. The first is the music is absolutely fabulous. And I mean, it's difficult for me to appreciate this because I wasn't alive, but the social impact of this record was enormous. And it just hit a sweet spot, in the mid to late 60s. And you could argue the Beatles were certainly of their time. They sort of peaked at the right time, essentially. And the social impact was absolutely enormous of this record, both here and in the US, actually.
Yeah.
So this is a first UK stereo press, and it's denoted by its fully laminated sleeve, but it's got these internal flip backs that you can see there.
So on the gate, if you open up the sleeve and the gatefold, it's got the picture of the four Beatles in their kind of military style uniforms, but that sleeve is folded over at the top.
Yeah, and of course has the lyrics on the back, which was unusual at the time.
Yeah.
And this first press actually had a wide spine, so The theory is that the Beatles wanted to include lots of freebies with this,
Yeah.
sweets and toys, small toys and things. So this original wide spine, the theory is that it was designed to accommodate some of those items. But of
Right.
course, EMI balked at the idea of including too many freebies.
Yeah.
So this sleeve design didn't last very long, and it was very quickly replaced by this much narrower sleeve design that you can see there. But
Really
the
keeps the
LP,
record, doesn't it?
it did come with some things.
So if I remember rightly, it has a cardboard cutout
Yeah, so it
with
came with this cutout,
got yeah.
printed on dark green card. The later issues, this is printed on a lighter green card. And the original first presses came in this fabulous sort of red and white psychedelic design sleeve.
In a sleeve. Yeah, I've seen a few of those.
Absolutely fabulous. That was designed by an art collective called The Fool, based in
Right.
Europe. Um, and of course, like most of the LPs, certainly early to mid LPs, is on this fabulous canary yellow parlophone
Yeah.
label, which is lovely. Um, and I'll just show you. So if you look at the pictures from the Sergeant Pepper launch party, you'll see the Beatles holding one of these wide spine
Right.
LP, and these are probably the most collectible of the original Beatles first issues of Sergeant Pepper. There is another collectible sleeve. Um, so this one here
Yeah.
again is a very early press, and it's a narrow spine. It's actually the one I showed you a few seconds ago. But what you may be able to see is that it has some text in the top corner there.
Oh, I see. So if you open it up in the gatefold, in the top right-hand corner, there's a little bit of text. Yeah.
Yeah, so that says fourth proof on it, and there's also some code numbers on the inner side just here.
Yeah. Right near the line. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a proof sleeve. It's a little bit unclear whether this came before the wide spine or in fact was a sort of a proof design of the later narrower spine sleeve.
Yeah.
But these are very collectible. There's quite a few of these about actually. They're not too difficult to find. They pop up quite frequently, so they're quite easy to find, but still very, very collectible.
So what value point would you put on those if somebody's got one?
Yeah, so a really nice condition, wide spine Sergeant Pepper, either mono or stereo. But the stereo actually is probably worth slightly less than the mono. The Beatles and George Martin spent a lot of time on the mono mix for Sergeant Pepper, and John Lennon famously said, "You haven't heard Sergeant Pepper unless you've heard it in mono."
Right.
So the first press mono wide spines can go for three, four, £500 in really good condition. The stereo's a little bit less, but still quite a lot of money. The fourth proof LPs, probably somewhere similar for a really good condition
Yeah.
copy of that, sort of three to £500 on the open market.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Majority of my guess. I mean, I sell quite a lot of Sergeant Peppers around about the 50 to 80 pounds mark.
Yeah, that's probably primarily related to condition.
Yeah.
A lot of them, like all the Beatles LPs, a lot of the Beatles LPs in the 60s got loved to death.
Yeah.
Um, I can show you this. This is actually what most of the records look like, original records from the 60s.
So Jim's holding up a copy of With the Beatles, which somebody's put their signature on the top.
Yeah. So as you mentioned earlier, there was a lot of these LPs got taken to parties, and of course,
Yeah.
if you took your record to a party, you certainly wanted to make sure you got it back.
Yeah.
So a lot of the kids in the 60s would write their name on the LPs. And you can see it's just a little bit dog-eared and it's tired. And of course, quite rightly, it's been loved and used, and that's what they were designed for. You might even be able to argue that the pristine copies are, possibly a little bit sad that they weren't played as much, or in some cases even at all, actually.
Yeah.
And this particular copy did exactly what it was designed to do, and lots of people got a lot of enjoyment out of this record. The other big problem in the 60s, which is illustrated by, again, another copy of With the Beatles.
Yeah.
The other big issue is that a lot of people smoked.
Yes. Yes.
And you can see
that
what
one that you're holding up is quite discolored on the back, isn't it? So it's almost nicotine stained, slightly brown stained.
Absolutely. So whilst the front is laminated, the backs often were not laminated. Certainly,
Yeah,
of the very early issue Beatles LP. So if there was a smoker in the house, it would discolor all of these unlaminated back panels, and this is what the vast majority of original Beatles LPs from the 1960s look like now,
yeah, yeah,
and again often with writing on them.
yeah.
But still, perfectly playable. I mean, one of the great things about the original presses from the 60s is they were pressed on heavy vinyl and they were pressed with deep grooves. So they could take an awful battering and still play really, really well.
Yeah.
Even to the point that you could have feelable scratches on the records and they would just play through because they were pressed so well. They're almost like Welsh roof slating tiles, that sort of quality. So they would tolerate a lot of damage. Unlike, in contrast, a lot of the records from the 1980s, which were pressed on much thinner vinyl and not quite as deep, they would be less tolerant of damage.
I always
Uh,
give a wobble test, so you can hold the thing up. You can tell if it's a thin copy by, like literally just
yeah,
holding the thing up and wobbling it. And the early presses don't do that. But
no,
but I
no,
did.
not at all.
I sold a Jimi Hendrix album to somebody recently, and he was nervous about it because he was a visitor up to Annie, and he found this album and he got out, and it was pretty scratched. And he said, "I don't know about this." And it wasn't a cheap record. And he said, "I'm not sure if that'll play." I said, "Well, I'll tell you what. Give me your address. I'll take it home and I'll play it and I'll video it and we'll see what happens. And if it's rubbish, then obviously you're not going to want it. There's no point in me selling it to you." And I took it home thinking this is going to do all sorts of nasty damage to my needle and everything else. It was perfect. It played
Yeah,
absolutely perfectly. To look at it, you wouldn't have put it anywhere near your system, but to play it, no problem.
yeah.
It sounded
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, of course, if anybody listening to records, you have to accept, I think, that you're going to get pops and clicks and static and background. And that's, you could argue, part of the charm of playing vinyl records. But once you get to the point of, record sticking or skipping, frequently, then it becomes a little bit difficult to listen to, doesn't it? And I think a lot of collectors really don't want that. Some don't mind, but I think most collectors would try and avoid records that stick or skip.
Yeah, yeah. It's unless they're really, really hard to find. It's the only one.
Yeah,
You
and
know.
that's I think in most cases the condition is king essentially, but very occasionally for some of the super rare records, like for example the original first press stereo Please Please Me, if you found a copy of that, even in bad condition, they're
Yeah.
so rare and difficult to get hold of. You would just go for it regardless of the condition really, as long as the price was
Yeah.
acceptable.
So speaking of rare, I'm going to hold up this copy of Revolver, which I've got here. So Revolver, black and white cover. It's the mono version. It's got the way that the wraparound sleeve is on there. But this copy of Revolver, as we alluded to earlier on today, I've got another copy here. Looks identical. So if you can see those on the screen, if you're watching this on YouTube, but this one is worth an awful lot more than this one because this is what you said earlier on. This is a Mix 11. So talk to me about Mix 11. You touched on it earlier on, but why is this one so the collect? What's the story behind it?
Yeah, so it has essentially an alternative version of John Lennon's Tomorrow Never Knows, which is, of course, one of the Beatles' greatest songs. And the original story goes that the pressing plant in Hayes in Middlesex pressed the wrong mix of the album, essentially. But actually, that's not true. What happened was during the production of the album, several mixes of several of the songs were made, including particularly Tomorrow Never Knows, because it was quite a complex song to put together, and it involved editing different sections of the song from different takes that the Beatles recorded, and there were several different versions of that song. And originally, George Martin decided that he was going to use Remix 11, and that's what got sent to the pressing plant. But on day one of pressing, the myth is that he changed his mind and contacted EMI and said, "I want to, change the mix on Tomorrow Never Knows." and switch it out from Remix 11 to Remix 8. And of course, if it had been any other producer and any other band, EMI would have probably balked at that idea.
Oh,
But
yeah.
because it was the Beatles and George Martin, they stopped the presses and replaced the mix with Remix 8. So the matrix number goes from XEX 6061 to 606-2, and then also very soon thereafter -3.
Yeah.
So there are actually three original mono mixes of side two of that album, all of which actually you could buy on the day of release in 1966, interestingly. But the myth is that the -1 matrix, which has the Remix 11 version on it, was pressed for approximately 1 day.
Yeah.
So there aren't too many copies of that LP in circulation. The more common versions, the -2 and the -3, they're much more frequent.
Mhm.
But all of them were available on the first day of release.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's the theory. So yeah, so that Remix 11, if you listen to the version of the song, you can hear slight differences. It's 3 seconds longer than the Remix 8.
Yeah.
But ostensibly the same song. There aren't too many major differences, but it's definitely a different mix of that song.
I didn't know about that until you told me because I had it racked out in the shop. And you brought it up to the counter and went, Mark, you've got this wrong. This is not worth 40 or 50 quid or whatever I had on it. It's worth quite a lot more. And I was like, why? And you told me about this mix. So that one I've just held up is the one that I had in the shop that you found. And I just went, oh,
Mm.
I'm not selling that. I'm keeping it. So what would that one be worth ballpark now?
Yeah, so again, it's the condition is king. So a really nice copy, X plus near mint sort of copy. You're looking at high hundreds, maybe even some of them have topped, four figures. But certainly hundreds and hundreds of pounds for a really good copy. I mean, even a rough copy of that, because it's relatively rare, even a poor quality copy would still go for three figures for sure, low hundreds. But yeah, so it's a combination of the condition and the rarity of the LP. And again, in this context, because it's Revolver, which is widely considered one of their best albums, and it's affects one of their major songs, one of them perhaps more interesting songs, that adds a little bit of extra collectability and value to the story, I think. And I think every serious collector of the Beatles wants to have a copy of that in their collection.
Well, I actually had two
Mm.
after I found that, and one of the songwriters that I used to manage, he was owed a few. I'd collected some royalties, and actually I swapped. He said, "Look, you keep my royalties, and I'll have that other copy of Mix 11 because he's become quite a vinyl collector as well." And I
Mm.
still can't work out who got the better end of that deal because the royalties weren't that much. But I have a copy, so I did have two copies, and I have one copy. Um, but didn't you once tell me there's one particular matrix number on that can be worth quite a lot more? Or have I got that wrong?
Oh well, that's on Revolver. I mean, there's other examples in the Beatles canon. So, for example, the first press of Rubber Soul, the mono version of Rubber Soul, which has -1 matrices on both sides,
Yeah,
that's referred to as the loud cut,
yeah,
uh, and that was pressed for about a week.
okay,
There were issues around jumping of the needle on some of the original early Dansette record players for that, and actually also with the Beatles, the
right,
first presses of with the Beatles mono version caused a lot of needle jumping. So in fact, with the Beatles, when it was first released in the UK, the mono version was actually recalled because it was causing a lot of jumping.
okay,
So the first presses of With the Beatles and also Rubber Soul are fairly collectible. They were pressed for quite a bit longer than the Revolver example
yeah,
we've just
yeah,
talked about. So there's more of them around. I do actually have this is actually
gotcha,
my copy of the first press of Rubber Soul. So this is a loud cut copy,
yeah,
and you can see it's in really, really nice
yeah,
condition.
it is,
Uh,
yeah,
so this has the I mean, this is, to find an LP in this condition is unusual.
Mm,
Again, we're talking, 60-year-old piece of cardboard, aren't we?
that's right.
And
That's right.
plastic.
Yeah.
Um, so this has the very first matrix numbers on both sides. And we think this was pressed for about a week. So
Mm,
that's still quite a lot of copies. If you think back then, the pressing factory in Hayes in Middlesex could press, tens of thousands of records a day.
yeah.
That's still a fairly significant number of LPs.
Right. But I guess it's how many of those survived, and how many of those survived in good condition with the original inner sleeve and everything else. So
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where the numbers diminish significantly, and that's where the value comes from, I think, and the collectability. And actually for a lot of record collectors, it's the, trying to find one, it's the process of building that collection that's
I'm going to
actually
say
the joy.
it's the hunt, isn't it? That
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, I know that feeling. So move on from Revolver, the White Album,
yeah.
or as it was just known as the Beatles. I decided to delve into that again last night, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hadn't listened to it for quite a while. Really.
Mm.
But there's a number of different versions, and again, I've got a couple here. But I think one of my early ones is so this one. It's not a particularly low number. It's 213200, but it's what we call a top loader sleeve. So
Hmm.
it's come out of the top. It's got the black inner sleeves with the and it's complete with all of the posters. There's posters in there of all four Beatles, and there's another poster in there, which is a bigger poster. A lot of which are missing because obviously, when you would buy this album, that's what a lot of the kids wanted. They wanted to take the posters out and stick them on their walls, and I guess that's what they were designed for. But how many? there are, I know, a few different versions of that. But what's one of the most valuable ones? What would you be looking for in a White Album?
Yeah, so what you've just described there is a first press mono.
Yeah,
So the characteristics you mentioned, the top loader, fully laminated sleeve. I've actually got mine here. Um,
bet yours is in better nick than mine.
Slightly better condition than yours, but again, these are quite hard to find. And this is a top loader, and it's got the number. My number's a little bit higher than those. This is actually a stereo version. So from numbers 1 to 299,999 were
Yeah,
mono, and from 300,000 to 599,999 were stereo. And then there was also a small run from 600,000 to about 618,000 that again were mono. Um, so mine's a stereo version. It's actually number 0457404 on
oh
this
yeah,
one.
but I'm beating you by like 200,000 there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and
I've
there's
got
actually, you
another one
probably
here.
can't see it. There's a little stereo indicator text on the back there. You probably can't see that very well, but yeah, any sort of good condition, early press mono or stereo is sought after. The monos are significantly more sought after than the
Yeah,
stereos. One of the reasons for that is that because of the numbering system. So the early numbers were all assigned to the mono records.
yeah,
And collectors, or some collectors, it doesn't bother me particularly, but some collectors like to go for early numbers. Anything under 100,000 is considered relatively early, and anything under 10,000 is considered very early.
yeah,
If you're lucky enough to find something even lower than that, then you can sort of almost write your own price ticket for it. Um, so the theory, of course, is that all the low numbers, the first four, were given to the Beatles.
uh-huh.
Um, and in fact, Paul McCartney had said that John Lennon got number one because he shouted the loudest. But of course, we actually know that Ringo Starr got number one because he sold it a few years ago,
Right.
along with several of his other Beatles items. And it fetched just over £500,000 he got for his copy of number one copy of the White Album. Paul McCartney, we know, has number three.
Yeah,
Um, Although actually, interestingly, there is, this is of course the stuff of legend, but there is rumor that there are in fact multiple copies of certainly some of those earlier numbered versions.
right.
And in fact, we do know there's two copies of number three, one of which is Paul McCartney's. So the numbers that George and John got, we don't actually know. So it may well be that John got another copy of number one along with
Yeah.
Ringo. We just don't know. George Martin was given number seven.
Mhm.
He mentioned that in an interview in the 1980s. But relatively few of those early numbers have come on the market. And number five's come on the market and sold a few years ago. Number 18 has been on the market. And of course, that when you're talking that sort of really low number, which is what collectors are, hardcore collectors are really looking for, then you can write your own price ticket for
Yeah.
them. And a Ringo Starr's, I think it sold for something like £575,000 for number one, which is quite astonishing.
Yeah.
But what I would suggest to anybody getting into collecting Beatles records is perhaps not to focus too much on the number and just try and get a really good condition copy. And you can still find really nice X Plus near mint copies of the White Album for not too much money. And the value of those, of course, is going up over time. But to find a really nice copy, I think is certainly achievable. A good quality copy
I've had a
with all.
couple into the shop actually. I think there's one or two in there at the moment which are okay. And as a first purchase for a collector of an original version, they're great. You know,
Yeah.
and actually I had a really nice set of 80s pressings coming.
Mm.
You might have bought some of those off me actually.
I did. Yeah, some of them I did. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, again, if you can find a nice playable copy, fabulous. I mean, it's a brilliant album. It's my favorite album of theirs by a long way.
Yeah.
I love the fact that it's so eclectic and has lots of different styles of music on it.
Mm.
Even though, the caveat is they weren't working particularly together on
Yeah.
lots of the songs. There's essentially some solo songs on there.
You can see that.
Um,
Yeah, I was listening to it
yeah.
last night and thinking, well, that that this is these songs are not Beatles necessarily Beatles.
No, they certainly. I mean, there are some good examples of collaborative songs on that album, but there's a lot of songs that were, largely driven by one of the four members of the group. But I just love its diversity. It's fabulous, and sounds great. And if you can find a nice 70s, 80s copy,
Yeah,
certainly by the early 70s, this top loader went to side loading, but you
yeah,
also still had the numbers,
yeah,
but with a side loading sleeve.
yeah,
If you can find one from the 70s in good condition, it'll sound great. They're cut from the original analog master tapes and sound absolutely fabulous. So you might recall actually, Mark, in 2014, the original Beatles mono LPs were recut
that's right.
from the original analog master tapes. And you could either buy them individually or you could buy a box set. And the box set cost several £100s, I think maybe £350 back in 2014. Those box sets now, going for at least 10 times that sort of money.
Yeah,
Just because they cut from the original analog master tapes. But rather than source one of those 2014 originals, many of which, of course, are in great condition because they're quite new LPs, but you can source a nice 1970s copy, again, cut from the original analog master tapes, and they sound absolutely fabulous. So again, I'd suggest anybody getting into collecting Beatles, hunting out the 70s copies is certainly a cheaper way to start the collection for sure, and still get really good quality sounding LPs.
yeah. I was listening to it last night and got to track Piggies, and I'd forgotten that song was taken by Charles Manson as a kind of mantra for a whole load of serial killings across the states to the point where McCartney, I know, who wrote that song, was utterly horrified that it could have been interpreted in such a way because he intended it as quite a flippant song and a sort of dig at the upper classes,
Hmm.
and Charles Manson took it way further than that.
Yeah, he did. And that and Helter Skelter, that was the other song that he sort of channeled, unfortunately.
Yeah,
Actually, Helter Skelter is a good example of one of the major differences on that album between the mono and stereo versions.
yeah,
So I think the White Album is probably, certainly one of the albums that collectors like to have both the mono and stereo version because they're quite different. the mixes are quite different, and a lot of the edits for the songs are quite different. And Helter Skelter's probably at the top of that list in that the stereo version has a false ending that then kicks off and the song starts up again and ends with Ringo's famous "I've got blisters on my fingers"
Yeah.
scream at the end.
Yeah.
The mono version doesn't have that, and so
Right.
as a consequence, the stereo version is almost a minute longer than the mono version. So again, good example of differences between the mono and stereo. But there's lots of little edit differences between the songs on those two albums, and it's essential, I think, to have both versions of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. No, and I do.
Yeah,
So let's go to the last studio recorded album. Let's go to Abbey Road.
yeah,
Um,
fabulous album. Yeah,
and so I've got my first edition copy here, which I'm very lucky. I've got an absolutely beautiful copy that came in a collection, and again, I just thought I'm hanging on to that. I actually have a story behind this, because when I was working in the music business, the BPI had an annual kind of presentation conference, whatever, at Abbey Road Studios, and the keynote speaker was Sir George Martin. So we were sat there, and there's not that many people get invited, maybe I don't know, 100 or so, and I was sat there in Abbey Road, in the studio that the Beatles recorded in, with Sir George Martin giving the keynote speech, which was phenomenal. And then we had this, they'd laid out in the cafeteria area or the common room a load of tables, and I found myself at lunch sitting with Sir George Martin directly behind me. And when we arrived, we were given a sort of tote bag with a few bits and pieces in an Abbey Road bag, and inside that bag was a CD of Abbey Road. So I'm sitting in Abbey Road behind Sir George Martin with a copy of Abbey Road, and eventually I couldn't help myself, and I turned around at a break and I said, "Listen, I'm a massive fan, and I can't believe I'm sitting here next to you. Would you mind signing my copy of the CD for me, please?" And he looked at me and said, "Yes, of course, dear boy." And he put his glasses down and he looked at my laminate badge and said, "So it's to Mark, you're not going to sell this, are you?" And I said, "Are you kidding?" No way. Because I still have it in pride of place. But of course, as soon as I'd got my swag and I'd sat back down and a bit kind of starstruck and flushed, half the bloody music industry was sat up behind me and did exactly the same thing, because they were waiting for the first person to come and
no, you were that person. Yeah,
I was the only one that was sad enough to go and do that. So that's my Abbey Road story, and I'm so proud of that copy of
yeah.
the
I didn't know that story actually. That's quite a story. You've not
album.
told me that one before. That's really good. Yeah, I visited Abbey Road for the first time this summer actually. I managed to get access to Studio 2 for a lecture series, which was really nice to hear about the history of the recording studios,
Yeah,
and of course learn that it was actually originally just a standard residential house
yeah,
in St John's Wood in London, and it sort of morphed into this record studio. They purchased a little bit of additional land at the back and the side and built on Studio 2, and listened to a lecture on the history of the studio and the Beatles sitting in Studio 2, and had a tour of the control room and the stairs that lead up to the control room, and it was absolutely fabulous. And of course the studio is still full of all the original
that's right.
instruments that the Beatles played, the Lady Madonna piano and Mellotron and everything else that was used in the original recordings. And it was lots of other music fans and Beatle fans, some Pink Floyd fans, of course, there as well, because they recorded some of their canon at Abbey Road. So yeah, it was absolutely fabulous. Nice place. So yeah, and of course,
Yeah,
Abbey Road immortalized on the cover of this album,
yeah, with
outside on the zebra crossing, which again, I mean, we talk, almost, I say almost every Beatles album, has an iconic picture on the front, and
yeah,
right up there, isn't it? Absolutely fabulous. So this is a first press sleeve. You can tell that there's a couple of, well, there's three key features. One is you can see this little bit of white stripe on the zebra crossing. If I show you the second,
I'm just checking mine.
yeah, yours I think is probably a second.
Yeah,
So you can see the first press has a little bit less of this stripe compared to the
Yeah.
second
Got you.
pressing.
Yeah.
And then also the other difference is you can see the building here. So essentially the picture's slightly more zoomed in. You can
Yeah.
see that this building is a lot closer to the top
The
of the sleeve.
top right-hand corner
Yeah.
we're looking at now. Yeah.
But the big difference, which is on the back, the first pressings, you can see that the green apple and the text are misaligned. But on the second and subsequent pressings, the apple was aligned with the text.
Just looking at mine, mine is definitely aligned. So yeah, I've got a
Yeah.
sleeve.
So this version here, this first press version is called the misaligned apple sleeve, but it's a little bit misleading actually because it's not actually the apple that's misaligned. The apple actually stays where it is in
Yeah.
relation to the background picture. What's moved is the text.
Yeah.
So the text has actually shifted and the picture's again slightly zoomed in, which you can see the A for Abbey is a little bit closer to the edge of the LP compared to this version here.
Yeah.
So it could really be called a misaligned text sleeve.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the first press. Um, and there's another indication on the actual record label itself that the track Her Majesty is not credited on the label on side two. The very last song on side two is not credited on those very first presses. But there's plenty of these around.
Yeah.
You can pick these up still for reasonable money. And again, good condition. There's a lot of them. A lot of them were pressed at the time.
Mhm.
And there's actually probably more of these first press copies without the Her Majesty on the label than there are with Her Majesty on the label.
Yeah.
But regardless, if you get your first press matrices on this LP, it sounds absolutely fabulous. It's generally regarded as the finest sounding Beatles first press LP. It was mastered beautifully. It was mixed beautifully. It's absolutely fabulous. It's probably, thinking about the recent Giles Martin remixes, it's probably one that didn't need a remix because it's absolutely fabulous. And this is certainly my go-to version when I listen to this LP. Of course, I did buy the remix, but this is just an amazing sounding LP. Beautiful.
No, I agree. And it's got the black inner sleeves as well, which you're telling me were left over from the white album.
Yeah. So some of the early copies of this LP and also Yellow Submarine that came before this, they were still using leftover black inner sleeves from the White Album. And there's a little bit of a myth that the pressing plant in Hayes was, it was all very structured and organized. It probably wasn't. And I think EMI were very, very good at getting really good value of money out of everything they produced. So they never wasted anything. Anything that was left over from one pressing got used in another pressing. So you'll quite often find, for example, some of those early press with the Beatles discs, you will find those in later pressing sleeves. So you could it was not unheard of to go out in 1965, 66, 67, late 60s, buy a stereo copy of With the Beatles, and it would be in a late 60s sleeve, but it would actually have an early first press disc in it because those discs were left over because they weren't selling in 1963. So EMI certainly got good value for money out of everything they made, and nothing was thrown away. So those black inners left over from the White Album were used on Yellow Submarine and also on Abbey Road until they ran out, essentially. But the standard issue for this is the standard patents pending white inner sleeve that most of the copies of Abbey Road came with.
See, I'm just looking at mine's the black sleeve.
Yeah, very nice. Yeah, I mean they're hard. The black sleeves in good condition are hard to find. Collectors like them for that reason. Really, they're sought after. They weren't particularly kind on the records. They were a little bit rough, but certainly a lot of collectors would take the record out now and store it in an anti-static line sleeve just to keep the record nice and safe.
Not that guy.
No. No.
So look, there's probably got a little bit of time left. I know you've got a meeting to go to. So there's a couple of other albums that we touched on before. Oh, I'm just reaching across to try and find my version. So this is it wasn't a scheduled Beatles album, if you like. It's a kind of a compilation that was had. Um,
Mm.
I'm holding up a copy of Hey Jude, um, and it's a great compilation because there's a lot of this stuff didn't appear on other albums. They appeared on a series of singles, but I'm thinking particularly about Rain, the track Rain, which
Mm.
you can't get a more 60 sounding track than that. It's an amazing track. And even kind of, there's a different version of Revolution on there, Paperback Writer, Lady Madonna, Hey Jude. So is this particularly collectible? This
First presses of that are actually.
right.
So if it's pressed on the dark green Apple label,
Hang on, I'm going to open mine up and let's see. Oh no, I'm already thinking this is an 80s pressing. No,
yeah, is it Parlophone?
mine is a Parlophone.
Yeah, so that's a repress. So the original first presses, I mean, that will still sound great.
It does, yeah.
And without checking the matrix number, I would suggest that it was probably cut from the original master tapes. But the first presses on the dark green Apple label are very collectible. I mean, the first thing to note is that a lot of the cuts on that record are widely considered the best sounding stereo cuts of those particular songs.
Right.
So it's again like Abbey Road. It was pressed just after Abbey Road. It sounds absolutely fabulous.
Mm.
Really nicely mastered and cut record. But the original presses, they're again very collectible. Find a dark green Apple version. Even the second presses on the slightly lighter Apple, but pressed with the same metalwork, are still very, very collectible. The first presses on the dark green label, there's a couple of famous typographical errors. Um, the song Revolution is
Yeah.
incorrectly listed as Revolutions on some versions, and also Paperback Writer. The word paperback is separated into two words as a mispress on
Yeah.
some of those early versions.
I'm looking at
And if
mine.
you find a version with either one or both of those errors, those are quite collectible. And there's a few of those sort of examples through the Beatles canon. Another good example, a classic example, is the copies of the White Album that were pressed with the misspelling of the word raccoon from the song Rocky Raccoon. Um, and those are very collectible. There's a few examples through the canon of typographical errors and
Yeah.
issues like that that make those particular versions a little bit more collectible. But that's a really good album, very collectible, sounds great. Again, any sort of serious Beatles collector would have that in their collection. I don't have a first press, but I have a light green second press, but cut from the same metalwork.
Okay.
It sounds absolutely fabulous.
Yeah, but it's actually I don't know. I love that record, but there's another one I have here which we talked about. And this is the Beatles Yesterday and Today. So this is a very controversial cover. It was pressed in America, and it's the Beatles dressed in white coats with holding various body parts of dolls and kids and blood and bones and stuff like that, and which was withdrawn in the United
Mm.
States because it was causing all sorts of problems. So I know that there are versions of Yesterday and Today with a different sleeve that because they stuck it on, if you peel the other sleeve off, this might be revealed underneath. So this isn't an original, sadly. But how much are the originals going for? If you can,
Oh, it's tens of thousands in really good condition. Yeah. So, I mean, again, classic Beatles lore story, essentially. The record was released with this slightly risky, what we would consider in the UK as a risky, slightly risky cover.
yeah,
In the US was considered very risky, um, and was withdrawn very, very quickly. There was a bit of a reaction to it in the US. A lot of the LPs were withdrawn, but the Capitol, who were pressing and releasing the Beatles in the US, had actually pressed lots of copies. So rather than waste those copies, they simply pasted over the original butcher cover shot with an alternative picture of the Beatles standing next to a packing trunk, a
yeah,
very benign, not particularly interesting image.
yeah,
Um, so those went on release, but of course those are highly collectible now, and hugely sought after. Again, a really good condition copy of that, you're looking at several £1,000s.
yeah.
A mint copy you might even make five figures on the open market. So, yeah, very, very highly sought after. There is a trend, and it's been ongoing for a while, for people to peel off the trunk picture to reveal the butcher image
Yeah.
underneath. But I would suggest to anybody who's got one of those to please not do it, because of course the more that get peeled, the number of original
Yeah.
copies with the trunk picture slicked over the top diminishes even further, and they
Yeah.
become rarer and rarer until eventually, if they all get peeled, we won't have any copies of those original pasted over sleeves.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a really nice story.
I've come across one myself. So this, we're probably getting very short of time, but are there any other particular gems that you think we should talk about?
Yeah, just a couple of things very quickly. I mean, the
Yeah,
this EP, which you'll
Magical Mystery
recognise,
Tour
came
EP.
out. Yeah, this was the last of the Beatles EPs in the UK in the 60s.
Yeah,
And by this point, actually, the EP format was dying a very slow, painful death. In
yeah,
the early 60s, the EPs and singles were the primary format by which people bought their certainly Beatles fans bought their music. But the LP soon dominated that, and the EP died a death. So just to put it into context, their first EP, Twist and Shout,
yeah.
um, sold millions, and it sold so many, it actually reached number two on the singles chart in the UK, despite the fact that it was an EP.
Mm.
By the time the predecessor to this EP came out, no, the Nowhere Man EP, the sales had plummeted dramatically. So in '65, sales of EPs had dropped off the edge of a cliff. The Beatles had enough songs for an EP to make this double EP here, but not quite enough songs for an album. So they released this Magical Mystery Tour EP, which came with the
That's
records.
booklet in it, hasn't it? So
Yeah, it has a little booklet inside with some pictures from the film, also the lyrics in the middle,
yeah,
booklet stapled in the middle. This actually sold quite well in the UK,
mm.
and again, not difficult to find copies of this, and even really nice copies. It's they're fairly straightforward to find. But of course, when EMI uh, attempted to sell this idea to Capitol, it fell dead in the water. So EP sales in the US never really took off. Capitol did release two EPs of the Beatles in the US early on, but they didn't sell at all. So there was no way that Capitol was going to release a double EP in the US. So what they did instead was they came up with a Magical Mystery Tour album, which was essentially all the tracks from the EP plus the singles at the time, which includes Strawberry Fields, Forever, Penny Lane, All You Need Is Love, Hello, Goodbye, and the B-sides, etc. So they came out with this fabulous album, and this is probably one example, possibly even the only example, where Capitol actually did a better job in the US than EMI and Parlophone did in the UK in terms of marketing these particular songs. So such was the success of this album that it's now sort of part of the official Beatles canon in the UK. So even though this album didn't get a release in the UK until the mid 70s, a proper release until the mid 70s, it's now considered part of the official Beatles album canon. But in the 60s, you could actually buy this copy. So it was so popular, it was becoming popular in the UK that Capitol actually imported 50,000 copies
right.
to the UK. And every import copy has this sticker on that says,
Top right.
especially imported by EMI Records. And again, these are not difficult to find.
Mm.
And again, even in good condition. So this is on obviously a US album, but imported into the UK.
Yeah,
And it sold actually really well in the UK and charted at number 31 in the UK charts.
right.
In fact, it was an import. Such was the power of the Beatles' selling power that even an import record could chart in the main record retailer chart in the UK. So this is, of course, pressed on the fabulous Capitol Rainbow label and
Yeah.
is an original first US press of that album.
Fabulous.
So yeah, that's a sort of a nice story about how the Americans, I think, got it right in
Yeah.
this case. And yeah, Yeah, so there we go.
Fantastic. Well, Jim, we could probably talk all day because I think there's loads more uh, particular Beatles albums. We could go into box sets. We haven't touched on Let It Be. So
All the singles, yeah.
singles, and there's some newer box sets, box set of Let It Be, box set of Abbey Road that are becoming kind of modern collectibles. But maybe that's for a follow-up. We'll do that another time. But Jim Allan, thank you ever so much for joining us today on This Is Vinyl. This is fantastic. I've learnt loads. I'm hoping that everybody else will too. So just big thank you from me. And, I'll see you soon in the shop, I'm sure.
You're very welcome, Mark. Nice to talk to you. Thank you very much.
This podcast was presented by Mark Hobrow, produced by Swansfield Music. It was edited by James Gray for Kinetic Studios. Title music is Stoner Punk, published by Boost Music and Lift Music. Copyright 2024.